welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and the Ontario Agricultural College's event here today, focusing on supply chain vulnerabilities. We were having a little joke in the corner, and someone, oh, I thought it was supply management. No, supply chain vulnerabilities that we're talking about today. My name is Deb Stark, and I am the one of the directors on the board for the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and as I say, one of the sponsors of this project and this event. I want to begin this event by acknowledging that we're meeting on the Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for over 13,000 years in this particular area. We're on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. I think it's really important as we think about what we're going to talk about, and especially about climate change and what's happening to this world and this earth and how we're trying to figure out our way through it, that there are lessons to be learned from the people that have come before us and whose children still walk among us. We all know that the pandemic, climate change, and other disruptions have highlighted the importance of having a resilient supply chain that can adapt and respond to unforeseen challenges. And today we have an impressive lineup of experts who will share their insights on this critical topic and provide us with valuable ideas and strategies to build a more resilient supply chain. As I said, this is a hybrid event. We had over 200 people, I think you said, Al, registered. I don't know how many showed up. We always know there's a drop off, but still I expect there's a good number of people online today. If you are in a virtual audience, just remind you that you are muted. You cannot participate that way, but please use the Q&A to insert your questions through Zoom, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. I want to thank again the Ontario Agricultural College for being our partner in this event today, and actually they sponsored breakfast, so thank you, John. That's been great. And I'm now going to ask John Cronenfield, the Associate Dean for External Relations for OAC, to come forward and bring greetings on behalf of the college.
Well, thank you so much, Devin. It's wonderful to be here to see so many of us in person and also hearing about the virtual audience. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to be able to support this event. You know, OAC, the A is for agriculture, and this is fundamentally about what we're going to be talking about today, is supply chain vulnerabilities. Supply chains work and sometimes don't work or have some challenges, and layering on top of that issues around things like climate change, consumer behavior, how people respond to crises and uncertainty. All issues that I'm sure we know are important. And you know, I think back to where we were 3 years today. We were 1 week into a lockdown at our university that we thought was going to be maybe a couple of weeks, and it turned into a couple of months, and then kind of a couple of years. And so it all seems kind of surreal. So I think this is an appropriate time to be starting to talk about some of the challenges that we've seen emerge through the last 3 years, and think a little bit about what we've learned and how we can use what we've learned to shape private strategy and public policy to make sure that we've got a functioning and effective food system. So really pleased to be here, and thank you, Deb and Kathy, for including us in this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. And your comment about remember where we were 2 years ago today brings back another thing that the Agri-Food Institute, so also connected with the University of Guelph, and Kathy did a project early in the pandemic, in the summer and the fall, because it seemed to be time that the crisis was over. And we did, what did we learn? And where do we go from here? And the conclusion at that time is, you know, the system responded, it jiggled a little bit, the system responded, and everything was fine. I saw Evan Fraser, the head of the Agri-Food Institute in the fall, and I just said, how naive we were at that time. We did not understand. And people like Tom and Sanjay are probably going to tell us that we should have understood, but we didn't. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Al Muscle, who is the Director of Research for CAPI, and he's going to take things over from here. So Al, over to you.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for everyone for joining us this morning, and for those of you who are online, thanks very much for joining us as well. There's an old adage in public policy that one should never waste a good crisis. As the shadow cast by the COVID pandemic lifts, we now have a bit of an opportunity to reflect on the impact and performance of our agri-food supply chains and where gaps in policy were revealed. We come to this from a position of strength, understanding that our agri-food supply chain bent but did not break. And we did not witness widespread empty grocery store shelves confronting a worried base of consumers. But we must acknowledge that that was not the experience of some populations around the world, and that it could have turned out differently here. Moreover, we're encountering a flux of an ongoing flux in supply chains, with an aggressive push to buy forward and accumulate inventories of critical items, whether it's equipment parts, pest control products, fertilizer, seed, and also farm product feedstocks used by processors. This is a response to the fear that it will be less available or much more expensive later. This is less compatible with the lean thinking and just-in-time inventory management systems that have been evolved to reduce cost in supply chains, and is intensified by global geopolitical tensions and constraints in logistical infrastructure. Perhaps these are best exemplified by the difficulties being experienced by NATO countries in finding sufficient capacity and capability to resupply munitions given commitments in Ukraine. Increased volatility in climate and episodic weather events exacerbate or are a root cause for multiple of these threats. These kinds of vulnerabilities are quite apart from the many risks in our supply chains that are engaged on an ongoing basis in operations, whether it's on farm, processing elsewhere, themselves quite challenging and subject to extremes. So it was in this regard that CAPI sought the support of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to fund a study of agri-food supply chain vulnerabilities. The study funded by AAFC is intended to help us identify the source of threats to our agri-food supply chains, their potential impacts, and how agricultural policy could be beneficially deployed. So the session this morning will provide observations of converging crises that agri-food supply chains in Canada and around the world must contend with. In particular, where climate change is a threat multiplier of agri-food supply chain disruptions. Now, so the program this morning is going to begin with a short presentation, followed by an open panel discussion of our panelists. Following the presentation, we'll jump straight into the panel discussion. So we're going to save the questions for after the initial presentation until later. So a reminder for our virtual audience that you need to submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, which we will be monitoring. I'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible during the time frame for our discussion. For those of us in the room, you can just walk up to the mic and when the discussion opens up, we'll get to the questions. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Tom Armstrong, who's going to provide our opening presentation this morning. So Tom is the president of Madison River Group, a strategic consulting firm specializing in earth systems, consulting, water resources, climate change, population dynamics, ecosystem and resource assessments. Prior to Madison River Group, Tom served as the senior executive science policy advisor in both the Bush II and Obama administrations in the United States. With extensive experience in multidisciplinary science, policy analysis, and federal government program development, Tom's team at the Madison River Group transforms complex problems into solutions. So with that, I'm going to call Dr. Tom Armstrong to come up and give us our opening presentation.
Here are things that I know you have to just project instead of microphone. That way the owl will focus on you for our online participants. Are you okay with projecting into the room?
What does projecting into the room mean?
Just
Am I projecting?
You are projecting. That is beautiful. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I'm good. Good morning.
Morning.
How's everybody doing?
Awesome.
I know a bunch of the project folks that you'll hear from this afternoon didn't sleep so well. They called me all night, asked me to come down and warm up some milk for them. Tell the story, William, right? Yeah. I want to start out today by first saying thanks to Al for letting me speak to you today. I have to get permission from Al to do everything. But for CAPI in general to serve the role that it serves. And one of the things I've learned in the little interaction I've had with Al, yesterday was the first time I've met him face to face. In fact, yesterday was the first time I met a lot of our folks face to face. We've been in that sort of post-COVID crazy world that we live in. We're still doing everything by Zoom, and it's certainly effective and efficient in a lot of ways, but really miss that, person to person kind of interaction. And, I'm making a short story long, and I apologize for that, but one of the things I've learned in listening to Al and then Steve Duff, I met him last night, is that it is really complex trying to figure all this stuff out, not just supply chains and their efficiencies or deficiencies, or not just looking at, what are the disruptors of things in agriculture writ large. It's not a simple story. It's never straightforward in anything we do. But there are some basic tenets, especially around the climate piece, but it applies to geopolitical instability, it applies to COVID, it applies to anything that you can think of as a disruptor of the way that we live our lives or do business. And along those lines, one of the things that I really want to get across today to you is the realities of climate change. What really should keep you up at night, if anything? And what are some things that may be actual downright opportunities for you as individuals, but also for the sector of agriculture, both for growing plants as well as raising livestock? I've held over 100 different stakeholder engagements with different farming groups in states of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. And I can tell you, in everything I've done with the agriculture community, and I'm a geologist, by the way, by training, my PhD is in geology. Everything I've done with the agriculture community, you seem to have a step ahead, you seem to be a step ahead of other sectors in understanding that there's been a change in your landscape or in your land, in your crops. There's been a change in water, quantity as well as quality. There's a change in what's going on in the environment around your farms or around the people that you work for as farms. You seem to be a step ahead of a lot of people, and that's an advantage that's going to help you in dealing with climate change as it really starts to come up to these parts and starts to really interact more in a way that you can feel it, you can taste it, you can touch it. So if anything, if I can leave you from this talk, it's going to be a highlight of where we are with the most recent IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, AR6. I'll go through it and I'll talk about what I think are some of the highlights and what they mean for you, what they mean for us. And then from there, I'd like to act as a segue into what we'll be talking about for part of the rest of this morning, hopefully, but also into this afternoon with the project that several of us are involved in, that CAPI has been so gracious as to help us support. So let me see what I can do here to catch up with, now that I've talked for 20 of my 20 minutes. This slide up here that you can see better than I can is probably the paramount slide to the summary for policymakers of the 6th IPCC assessment report. I led IPCC AR5 for the United States. And in order to get any report out, there has to be a unanimous agreement of every single word of whatever document it is that you're reading. And that's especially true of the summary for policymakers. Every I has to be dotted, every T has to be crossed. At the time of AR5, the one that I was involved in, we had 186 countries. And if you think the politics are diverse in Ontario, you should try 186 countries, getting them to agree on anything. So I'll leave it at that in terms of, some people argue, well, that makes it stronger. Some people argue, well, that makes it the lowest common denominator of what we really need to do in order to take action. But one of the things I will try to come back to, and I hope we can have a discourse on, is it's one thing to develop a pledge for mitigating the emissions of carbon to the atmosphere, or for doing any kind of adaptation actions that might help us to cope along the way as we eradicate whatever the problem is. And in the case of global warming, the disequilibrium amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. So it's one thing to do all those things, it's another thing to take action. And that's one of the things that we need to be constantly asking ourselves is, Paris is not action, it's a pledge. It's like saying, I'm going to get married, but we haven't even picked out a ring yet. Really taking action, turning a pledge and a promise, a vow, into action when it comes to climate change has not been done. Not enough. That's something that I'll talk about throughout the rest of this talk, and hopefully show you some insights as to where I think the ag sector has a leg up on other sectors. Not that it's a competition, but that I see you as true leaders of the effort to act. That last slide, let me just quickly say something about it. You'll see that there's different generations along the way, and it's a powerful slide in that it makes you realize that as you come from left to right, you're going from the blue cooling into the hot reds, where there's significant warming by 2100. And you can see that the people that are on the right of 2020 are those generations that have yet to come or have yet to really be fully impacted. You can see a 70-year-old woman in 2050 who's come across the 2020 line. But you can see some children like my granddaughter there, Avery. Boy, she owns me too, I'll tell you. I can't tell you how much money I forked out on that little girl right there, but she's worth it. Coming left to right from 2020, that really should be something we pause and think about. The decisions we make today, a lot of us will be dead by the time they really are implemented and we feel them. But the decisions of today have a lot to do with those people, especially the young ones, that are just to the right of 2020. It's a huge responsibility that we face of getting it right, not getting the politics right, getting the solutions right, whatever it may be. So the slide that I have up here, why do I have it up there? Because it's missing something. There it is, look at that animation. One of the things that I hope you've looked at that a lot of people fail to look at is that what is the monetary cost of doing nothing? What's the monetary cost of doing something after something has already occurred? In the United States, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which is part of the Department of Commerce, has started to release on a yearly basis a report that outlines and identifies and adds up the major climate-related impacts or disasters that are $1 billion and over in the United States. The first time we did it, I think it was back in 2014, 2015. There was, I think, 4 or 5. As of last year, don't quote me, but I think it was up to 16 or 17, over $1 billion. Now I'm counting some of the indirect costs as well, things that we hadn't been adding up before. When it's all said and done on a yearly basis, there's about $1 trillion lost due to climate-related catastrophes or climate-related actions that are occurring. Everything from a minor flood to a major wildfire. It all adds up, and it's not only costing dollars, it's costing lives. And I know you know this, but it's important I'd like you to take a look at that report because I think it's still incomplete in what's actually looked at and identified and counted. This diagram is the first one where it starts to talk, I think, about, well, wait a minute, there are some opportunities. My granddaughter, Avery, calls that one the lifesaver one with the stripes, the one on the left, the top left. This is looking at water availability and food production and health and well-being. And if you look at the key on the right, it shows you what's being impacted. If it doesn't have the lifesaver stripes like the one on the top left, it's about adverse impacts. But look at the ones over here, principal water availability and agriculture and crop production, were both looked at in detail by IPCC. In fact, there was a special committee that looked into the ag piece. There unfortunately isn't any so far special reports that are in the works on this, but I think it's coming. And they found that there was not only adverse impacts from climate change, but in the short term, there will be some positive impacts as well. That you have some of these different growing zones that are going to move north, and there will be some short-term benefits that you may start to see, but there's the opportunity of seeing those things in places like Canada and northern parts of the United States and so forth. So I just put that out there to show that I was heartened by the fact that IPCC wasn't just adding up all the bad things or all the quote unquote disasters, but we're also looking for opportunities where we might be able to frankly take advantage of a situation that just works in our favor the further north you get. It's a long and complicated story. It isn't a long period of opportunity, but it is an opportunity, or there are opportunities. A lot of the report in AR6, the sixth assessment report that just came out, really focuses on two issues. One of them is the tale of two extremes, that there are many places now in the same parts of the world where in one season there's massive flooding going on. And a lot of this has to do with very disturbed weather patterns, which I am, for one, and many others now believe has a lot to do with the perturbation of the polar vortex. But in a lot of places, we're now starting to see places that in one season, you can define what it is, you'll see a lot of flooding. In another season, you'll see a lot of drying going on. And in close proximity, we'll see areas that are very prone to drought in close proximity to areas that are starting to systematically flood and regularly flood. It's a strange phenomena. It's causing weather forecasting a lot of trouble, but there's a lot of examples now of extreme events starting to dominate the landscape when it comes to things that are climate related. And I want to point out that when it comes to the nomenclature of climate change, whenever I use the words climate change, I am referring to human-induced change that was caused by emitting quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that have heated up the atmosphere, but it's primarily human caused. Whenever we start talking about natural climate changes or climate activities, that is more in something that we just call climate, or we'll use other words to describe it. La Nina and El Nino circulation patterns are a great example of what's called climate variability. Those are natural processes, and they are being amplified and perturbed by a lot of what's going on with climate change, the human-induced piece as well. It is not a simple story. One of the things that's also increased a lot in areas around the country that are drying more than they're getting wet, and this includes the Southeast, the places like Florida, is the propensity for wildfire as a significant risk has gone up tremendously, both in terms of actual fires, but also fire prediction. And right now we're looking at about 2/3 of the country being in a high risk for fire during some period of time from, well, in this case, the diagram we took was just a 2022 snapshot, but going out about 10 years, the National Integrated Fire Center, NIFC, out in Boise, Idaho, has predicted that each of the next 10 years will have a significant risk to major parts of the country due to wildfire, which is brought on by drought and brought on by dryness and an increase, therefore, in the fire fuel loads. The other problem, though, is on the other side of the extreme, that we're seeing a lot of areas like where I come from in Montana, where farmers are just not growing stuff in certain parts of their farms because the grain is so heterogeneous, or the precip is so heterogeneous, that one part of their farm will be totally flooded, look like a lake. The other parts of the farm, they're not dry, but they're certainly tillable and they're certainly plantable. If that's a technical term or not, I don't know. But there's so much heterogeneity going on, even at the most local of scales. But rest assured that farmers and ranchers are dealing with areas where there's too much water and other areas where there's not enough water. And they're asking questions about what can we do about this? What are some solutions for the near term that would help us achieve better results? Alan, you coming over here to check on me or?
No, you're good.
Okay, just want to make sure. One of the things that AR6 shows is that no matter what, we're going to see extremes becoming more widespread and pronounced. And this slide was, I think, rather telling that when you start looking at things that mean something to agriculture, like annual hottest day temperature change, there is a progressive increase in annual hottest days in terms of both the number of days, but also the delta change from a baseline of, you pick whatever the baseline is, it doesn't matter. It's progressively getting hotter and it's becoming hotter more frequently. We're seeing a lot more places around the United States where it's reaching at some point in time, usually in the summer, of course, but some day becomes more predictable the closer you get to. Where we're starting to see 100 degrees or more in places that never achieved 100 degrees before. One of those is my hometown, Bozeman, Montana, where it hit over 105, where we had at a time where we had never had 100-degree heating days before. And it's becoming more frequent too, as I said. Now, I want to go back to looking not only at the risks increasing, but also some of the opportunities. And this slide to me is one of the most important in the report. It's a little hard to follow, but if you just look at the stuff up on top, when you look at global reasons for concern, including the ones that we put in the report that I worked on in 2014, but the most recent one, the AR6, there's a lot of risk and impact that's being predicted across different sectors or zones in unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, distribution of impacts. You can see that when you go from that yellow up from undetectable white to moderate risk in yellow up into high or very high risk, and there's a lot of that around the country. There are some places where if you did the right, quote unquote, right thing, you could actually see your risk lowered significantly. And there's no better example than in food insecurity. If you look at the qualifications over here of high versus low challenges to adaptation, the more money you make in early not only money, but human capital in terms of expertise and support, the more of an investment we make now to try to help protect ourselves for the years to come, rather than doing it as an afterthought, leads us to SSP1 scenario, which is a societal scenario in which, as I just said, we make a lot of healthy investments in our various adaptation actions, as well as other processes. And we provide not only an investment in terms of money, but workers. We end up with an SSP1 scenario in which, relatively speaking, the risk of impacts is really lowered significantly. And a lot of work is being done on further quantification of this. This is really the first time we really showed this laid out for different time slices and different sectors. But the bottom line is that no matter what you hear out there, there is more than hope. There are things that we can specifically do to lower our risk and to mitigate the impacts of climate at all scales and all places. We're just about all places. This one's a little hard to follow. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it basically is looking at the climate resilience development, or what's called the CRD. And that basically is, if you make investments into resilience, making landscapes or sectors more resilient, can we actually track in a way in which we actually have significant opportunities for enhancing our resilience or our resilience capacity? Now, this is kind of counterintuitive the way they drew this, because as you go up, when you think about this in terms of other diagrams, it looks like it should be increasing, but what's actually happening here is that the opportunity is decreasing it's increasing rather than something bad. It's actually something good if you go up. And what we're trying to do is get to a place where the actual actions that have been identified that we should be taking, which are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, we're actually tracking along that direction in order to achieve those results. Again, it's a bit of a weird document. You see there are things in there called shocks, which we'll talk about this afternoon, but the bottom line is that based on our ability and our desire to make investments of financial resources, but also human capital, we can actually go from just doing science into providing services, and that would be the end of my talk and my plea, in which we can actually turn the tide. We can actually start to see positive impacts from the work we're doing. But the problem is we're not doing a lot. We're still saying there's a lot of science to be done. And of course there always is. But it doesn't mean that just because we haven't completed the science, that we can't start to take at least basic actions that can help to sort of help us all to cope with what we're going to be facing over the next several decades. Truthfully, the longer we wait in mitigating the greenhouse gas problem from the atmosphere, certainly the longer we wait, the more difficult it's going to become. And the less likely that we're going to be able to re-equilibrate or return to anything like what our parents lived through in terms of quality of the environment, or that we've even lived through. Things are going to become different. It's just going to be that way. But if we get down into the details of understanding where some of the gaps are in our understanding that need to be filled, we stand a lot better chance of really coming away with making some positive differences. And I think once people start to see a change for the good, a change for better outcomes, better environment, more profit, whatever your metrics of success are, we're not always going to see good scores or good cases of success, but they'll start coming. And when they do, I think people will start to relate more back to what is climate change, because it's so hard. You can't taste it, you can't touch it, you can't really feel it, but the science says it's there. And in the case of the work that we're doing on this project, we're trying to get down to a detailed level of starting with climate change as a force and identifying some of the disruptors that actually are produced through climate change that can have both positive and negative benefits, as I've talked about, probably to the point of making you sick now. At the end of the day, if we do enough of this and do it well, we can identify some of the major disruptors that are out there that affect not only agri-food security directly, but other things like supply chain efficiencies and other forces or other what we call converging crises. Those things like geopolitical instability, overpopulation, the list goes on, COVID, disease. There are things that are working together and interfering right now that are part of what this convergent crises that we keep talking about is. But by understanding the actual steps that lead to the changes and the disruptions, we stand a much better chance of figuring out what are the actual measures that we need to take to turn the science into action. And I'll stop there with the slides. I was going to go through this, but it's a repeat pretty much of everything I've already talked about. You know, the biggest problems I think we face right now in getting to action, which is really difficult to do, are number one, trust. We just don't have enough trust in a lot of places where a farmer, for example, can go to somebody and say, what do you think? I mean, you're a scientist. Do you really think you understand what's going on? And get an answer that they can understand in plain English. Too many times, and I'm talking about myself, too many times we try to answer somebody's clarification statement with an even more technologically complex answer, like going into the more technologically complex will somehow magically help even somebody who has less than a PhD for a degree, and that they'll all of a sudden just say, oh, now I get it. No, they're not going to get it. We have to be able to take the science as scientists, working with other people in services, communications experts, extension service people. We talked about this a little last night with Steve and with Al. We have to be able to work with folks like that and take the complex science and distill it and translate it into a language like English that people can use, where the actual information is knowledge, not just data. And that knowledge can be useful and usable for all levels of decision making. I've tried doing this for 20 years in the United States federal government to develop a national climate service, and it hasn't succeeded. And I think the main reason for it is the political half-life doesn't bode well for building trust. I think the political hijinks that we see in the United States, and I've served in both White Houses, Republican and Democrat, both have good people, both have assholes, to be perfectly honest. But the fact that the good people are never around long enough to see a change through prevents us from taking a lot of action in the first place. These are the kind of things we have to change. And frankly, it starts with people like you, people in academia, people out on the farms, people that are part of larger corporations, even smaller corporations. It takes people from all walks of life to really make the difference and to make this work. But somehow we have to figure out a way, because there is an opportunity here, right now, for taking action. And if we don't, then there will be action, but it'll be out of our hands, and we will no longer control our own destiny. But also don't let anybody tell you that we already don't. We do when it comes to climate and other disruptors. So I'll stop with that. I probably won't wait too long. Thanks for putting up with me, and thanks for this opportunity. I really look forward to talking to you guys more. I'm gonna sit up front, I'm gonna throw stuff at me.
Thanks very much, Tom. You gave us a lot to think about there. Just a couple observations that I took away from it. The idea of opportunities around climate change, I think we need to think about that, especially in a northern climate, and what we can contribute and what we can take away. I really like the slide around the disruption space and how you see the challenges with climate cascading into a range of other issues, both positive and negative. And you know, you had a slide there with what looked like a plowed field. It was pretty wet. And you know, we think about in this climate, Eastern Canada, our problem is most years anyway, it's not good. It's getting things to dry up and warm up fast enough in the spring of the year so we can get a crop in the ground. And because we're a northern climate, we are constantly pushing the boundaries of what our climate will allow for. And you know, as Tom was preparing for this, you know, I said to him, you know, an offhand comment, you know, in my lifetime, you know, if you take a measure of heat, corn heat units, corn heat units are quite material in my lifetime. And I shared with a little chart, Weather Innovations produces of corn heat unit zones in Ontario, which many of you are familiar with.
Sorry, Mark, can you talk a little louder just for those online?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, it's usually not a problem. If you take a look at a map of corn heat unit zones in Ontario, and the one I had was the benchmark period was 1971 to 2000, and then I had a second one was 2011 to 2020 average. And for most parts of Ontario, the corn heat units are up about 20%. So that's a lot. But you know, I went further than that with Tom. I said, well, you know, but if you look at the growing season, if you take Elora as an example, which is a research station there, the growing season hasn't changed any. So I went back and you know, you can track the first killing frost of a given crop unit, And, you know, the short answer is it's October 10th or thereabouts, and it hasn't changed much. So since 1969, I think we probably have recently about 7 day, you know, taking out outlier years, you probably have about a 7 day longer. So what we're doing, you know, one of the local effects that you can immediately pick up on from what Tom's saying, we got 20% more heat in essentially the same period of time. So we begin to think through, and as farmers do constantly, what kind of pressure that puts on us in terms of pest control, how we choose varieties, how we time practices to prepare soils, and so on. It's becoming more challenging. So thanks very much, Tom. I want to move on to introduce our panel, and I think I'm going to start with Sanjay. So Sanjay, if you want to come up, I'm going to introduce everybody here. Sanjay Khanna is the Chief Futurist at SK Futures, a strategic foresight consultancy that enhances the resilience of individuals, organizations, and communities. Formerly a futurist, one of the world's largest law firms, Sanjay helps organizations plan for multiple plausible futures and identify opportunities while managing convergent risks. He focuses on addressing crises related to geopolitical instability, socioeconomic shifts, climate change, human health, and technology. Our second panelist is Dr. John Cranfield. John's the Associate Dean for External Relations at the Ontario Agricultural College, University of Guelph, and Professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics. With a PhD in Agricultural Economics from Purdue University, John specializes in the economics of consumer behavior and demand analysis in relation to food and food products. And I should add, John's been extremely successful in spite of being a classmate of mine. Well done. And last but certainly not least, another guy who's actually been quite successful in spite of being a classmate. Steve Dodd is the Chief Economist at the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and an adjunct professor at the University of Guelph. Steve has worked at ONAPA for over 15 years. 26 now. It's over. I beg your pardon.
Gotta change those piles around those, Steve.
Leading business risk management programs. Steve obtained a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph in 1996. He's also the farmer vice chair at Farm Management Canada and runs a beef and cash crop operation near Colborne, Ontario, with his wife, Robin. All right, so each of our speakers, and I wonder if we can start with you, Sanjay. If you want to take sort of 5 minutes to make an opening set of remarks, and then we'll open up the questions.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and have this opportunity to engage with the room and also with the audience and with Tom's remarks and remarks from my fellow panelists. In this project, when thinking about supply chain vulnerabilities, what we've been hearing in some national consultations is that there seems to be a consensus in the two areas we were looking at, which is the pork sector and the greenhouse sector, that there's a real concern about long-term planning. To look 5 years and beyond, sort of the 5 to 10 year range, and where are the services available to do that work effectively? There doesn't seem to be an entity, according to the respondents, that can provide integrated foresight services and some tools to understand the fast pace of the convergence of these complexities that are leading us to be very concerned that we might not be able to adapt fast enough to crises building up on each other. In this project, we've been thinking about the convergence of geopolitics, the pandemic, and climate change. And the other issues that have bubbled up are issues related to labor, not just access to labor and immigration issues as supply chain vulnerabilities, but also the health of labor because of long COVID, because of all the health-related disruptions that have occurred during the pandemic. And then there are also concerns that when you start looking across sectors and you get farmers speaking, you get processors speaking, you get folks in the retail industry, different parts of the supply chain speaking, and you add up all the vulnerabilities that they're mentioning in aggregate, it starts to become clear that you need some kind of process or method to figure out where to direct your investment so you can have a synergistic positive impact as these crises come at us. So what does resilience look like in the context of supply chain vulnerabilities that are building up on one another? And what kind of positive message does that send to the industry if you become more successful at doing that and galvanizing the great resources and talent and capacity that we have in the country around whether it's precision agriculture innovation that needs to happen there or other areas. Now, there are other risks around supply chain vulnerabilities that have emerged in the consultations where people have talked about ransomware and cyber risk, issues around aggregation of data, and those sorts of issues about who benefits from data that comes off the farms, who benefits from them when the data is aggregated in different places. And furthermore, what about the health of agricultural communities writ large in terms of the well-being? The fact that we're seeing rising food prices and rising costs and food insecurity in rural regions that are so critical to us also raises issues for the strength of the labor market. So again, we're seeing these things sort of build up, and what we're looking to do, and what I hope the foresight analysis piece of our work, combined with the work of others, in looking at vulnerabilities and in looking at different ways to synthesize these risks so we can figure out what to do, is that we harness this as a team and across different actors in the sector so that there can be a collective kind of resilience. Again, the other issue that has arisen is concerns in the farming community about consolidation, lack of negotiation, and those sorts of issues become even more acute as these pressures build. So there does need to be some kind of view that's values driven, that allows people to act in the interests of the agri-food system as a whole, even as they try to make sure that their organization profits and does well. And there needs to be some redistribution, at least according to many of the participants, of risk and responsibility when it comes to this, and rewards as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sanjay. John?
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be part of the panel. A couple things I want to mention. Sanjay, Tom, Al, and I met virtually last week to talk a little bit about the session. And one of the things I related to them was about my job. And I'm using my job as an analogy for, I think, a lived experience by many people who are facing these crises. And 80% of my time on my job is spent dealing with urgent issues that someone else has created, but I got to solve them. About 15% of the time, I'm dealing with urgent issues that are both, in an Eisenhower matrix, urgent, important, we need to do this, we need to move forward. About 3% is based on sort of important stuff that I think is going to matter and make a meaningful impact. And very, very small amount of my time is what I call blue sky time. George Schultz used to talk about his Schultz hour. He'd take time out every day, every week to sort of think blue sky. And I'm saying this to articulate what I think most people in the industry live every day, which is they're putting out fires. They're putting out urgent issues that need to get addressed. We've got to get this container on a ship. We've got to get this truck over the border. We've got to deal with this thing, this thing, this thing. But what that does is it takes away bandwidth and attention and your ability to think about what's going to happen next. And so my comment to when we were having a call was, encouraging people to think about widening that aperture, right? Because when we're in those moments of crisis, our brains kick in, the lizard brain, it starts to get to deal with it, fight or flight. You get the blinders on and you forget that there's a whole bunch of other things that are out there that maybe aren't urgent, but are really, really important. And so thinking about how you widen that aperture, both spatially and temporally, is really important. And it gets at, I think, some of the things that, Sanjay, that you do. And I go back to a line that I remember hearing the US government came out with after they'd done the assessment of 9/11 and what had gone wrong with their intelligence community. And some in the US government and the US military said the problem was a failure to imagine. And the reason why there was a failure to imagine was probably a little bit of hubris. I'm the expert. You should trust me, regardless of who you are. But also not taking the time to sit down, step back, widen that aperture, and think about 20 years from now, are we going to be growing coffee in Guelph because of climate change? Now, maybe it's not 20 years, if the trends keep going, maybe it's 100 years. But like honestly, start thinking about that. What's the world look like in 20 years? It may not be my problem to solve it. There's going to be someone else who has to solve it. But what we do today will impact that outcome. So thinking about stepping back, widening that aperture, making sure you've got that blue sky time to think about, well, what are those really big risks that we don't want to talk about that maybe are lurking? And don't be shy about that failure to imagine. And sometimes that imagination can be in a positive sense. We can do great things if we do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it can be, what are those risks that we're not facing or that we're not seeing, but that we know we're going to face?
Very good. Thanks, John. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Again, thanks, Alan, and thanks, Kathy, for inviting me to participate and for putting on this kind of information session. It's an important thing. To build on what's been said already, again, so I've spent my career in agriculture, my career in government, as John said, putting out fires, providing economic reason to so many different difficult issues. And, to reflect on the topic and the discussion so far, at the start of my career, Agri-Food resilience meant something different than it does today. It primarily meant farmers, primarily meant the effort to basically maintain production, to always produce as much as we can, to do it in the least risk environment that we can, to try to be as profitable as possible, and recognize that as a country, we're a price taker, that we, for the most part, operate at a maximum capacity all the time. And that, again, over the course of my career, we've transitioned from, an environment where we were, not completely integrated with the US at the start of the free trade agreements. Now we are completely integrated with them. And so in that context, from my perspective, Agri-Food resiliency has changed significantly. And going back to your earlier point about, a crisis and not losing the opportunity it takes to hopefully maybe spur some changes. I think at the start of COVID, as an example, to build on what John just said, there was a certain lack of imagination in terms of thinking that could we really face want, hardship, lack of whatever it is in a North American context. The US, I think, historically, I was saying to Tom last night, from my perspective, has faced those things many times. In an agricultural context, we in Canada, for the most part, haven't. And the way that our system has become resilient is that we've allowed, in my view, the meaning of what agri-food is to expand beyond the farm and be the entire value chain. But the entire value chain is not something that in the government context we have much control of, that we have much information about. It's the actions of individuals and firms. And, in the class I teach in here in a couple hours, I got to head back down to the university. We talk about data, and from the farm level up, the data gets less available. And part of it because it's proprietary and because it's so individual and personalized and complex. And that certainly for me was one of the challenges that at the start of COVID we really faced. What do we do if we can't plant a crop? In my career, we've never experienced that. And the resiliency of the system was that farmers, a science-based industry, we were able to work through that. But our ability to manage those risks is largely due to the fact that we are so integrated with so many other markets. And I think to just sum up, the risk that we face is the extent to which we can't quantify those risks until it's too late, right? We know there's a grocery shortage when we walk in and it's not on the shelf. And quite frankly, there isn't any real other early warning mechanism besides that. And so how do we in the sector collectively work on that when it's also the proprietary information of the retailer, who quite frankly is doing an excellent job of preventing that, to not want to signal to their competitor that they won't have those things. And I think, from my perspective, government has had a real challenge in working in that context, especially in ag, where we're used to knowing everything about everything.
Thanks, Stephen. And, you know, on that kind of goes back to some of the motivation on Captain's side to initiate a study of supply chain vulnerabilities. You know, just this idea, to your point, we don't see a shortage moving step by step through the supply chain. We don't have any sort of a dashboard that tells us, you know, here are the critical spots of vulnerability. Here's the pace at which the threats are moving. So they could be slower moving, but very significant, like climate change. They could be sudden and immediate. You know, you have a fire and processing plant or something like a rendering plant, and all of a sudden you've got an immediate disaster. We don't have that. We don't have that. And you know, if we're in a world where we're going to have to contemplate more of these kinds of things, probably going to need to have better information set, at least the awareness to be able to sense that better. So if we have any questions from the audience here in the room, you can raise your hand or step over the mic. I'm going to start with some questions from the chat, and I think I'll start with you on this, Tom. Is there a way to measure our success as we take actions in real time to keep motivating forward momentum? What are the top 3 actions we should push toward?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to the top 3, but the things that come to mind, going back to what Steve was talking about, is we definitely need both a monitoring system or systems, both for early warning, as well as for that metrics analysis as well. We don't have a good way right now of, at a larger scale, being able to say that we're having the desired effect we wanted to have, let alone that we've even got any kind of organizational structure like that, like an adaptive management loop, for example, that would help us through the whole climate crisis. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And then for early warning, there have been some great ideas that have been put forth before by one guy in particular. For 20 years was going up to the Hill, Pete Murdoch from the US Geological Survey, who had figured out a way of doing trading time for space substitution to figure out gradients and tipping points before anybody knew what the hell a tipping point was. He had been going up there to the Hill, Capitol Hill, and to try to find funding for the agencies in order to do this. And at the time, it was going to cost about 5.6 million. And he had a cost benefit analysis in this thing that showed that even then, 20 years ago, it would have saved about 10-fold or 20-fold that amount of money just to put something in like a prototype early warning system. So that's one of the major things that comes to mind. Metrics analysis in terms of being able to measure our performance when we get there to taking action. Early warning is important. And a third is definitely communication. We just do such a poor job of communicating what our needs are or what the issues are and what the solutions could be to anybody who has any kind of authority at all. When we do our climate assessments, for example, they're written purposefully for politicians, and they're written at a 5th grade level. I'll let you decide what that means, other than if we're missing the boat on that, and we may be doing that, then there's no way of communicating effectively to a lot of people that have a political bend. So but communication writ large, communicating internally about what the issues are, what climate change really is and what it's not, and also what the results are of studies where it's so clear that people are taking that lowest common denominator when it comes to both opportunities as well as crises.
Others on the panel?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind building on that a little bit. I mean, I think what we're seeing in terms of wealth and income inequality, on one of the slides that Tom had, they described that what would constrain actions that would help deal with the climate disruptors was ensuring there wasn't massive wealth and income inequality. There needs to be a hangry index. How hungry and angry are Canadians getting? And how are we responding to that? Because if you don't have those people who want to participate in Canada being more food secure, the first thing to do is to disenfranchise a whole bunch of people so they're not fed every day. And that's a real social tipping point. Tom talked about all kinds of tipping points, but I know in his work, they also look at social tipping points. What are the tipping points where food and agricultural insecurity experienced by the population is such that it creates other issues? And I would argue that even the protests in Ottawa were in part driven by real disenfranchisement of rural communities, because they're not eating enough, their situation should be stable, they're feeding the rest of us. And we have, somehow that has to be at the heart of the human part of this. And I really applaud both, Steve and John for being here to along with Tom and Al, to say we really do have to widen the aperture to pull the human element into the center of that, figure out what to measure in order to get people fed, so we can collectively embark on the other hard things we need to do.
And I think one point to add to that that's really important: meet them where they are. Yeah, I could go in as an expert, but I don't know that lived experience of that person who's experiencing food insecurity and income insecurity. You have to meet them where they are. You have to understand their lived experiences and think about from their perspective. What does a successful policy intervention or private strategy or whatever solution look like, and how does that resonate with them? Include them and have them be part of that process. Because you can be much more likely to have engagement and uptake on that if the solution is one that is not perceived as being pushed onto them, that they're part of that solution.
Yeah, we've seen that insecurity now aligned with fentanyl and the other causes of death. That were recently, the Canadian Institute for Health Informatics has just released that COVID-19 last year was the #2 cause of hospitalization. Drug overdoses were in the top 5 as well. So we have to see these things, when we talk about convergent crises or these issues converging, we're saying they're kind of amplifying each other and making the small problem bigger, and then adding another problem to that that's synergistic with that makes that even worse. And I hope we find ways to address that, because I really feel the food and ag industry is the fundamental aspect to our being able to think our way through these problems. If you don't have food, you're not thinking well.
Well, and just by, I think, illustration of what you're talking about in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, I think we've already had bread riots. And, there's some specific reasons for those, but when we have problems in this sector, it spills over pretty quickly in other kinds of issues. Steve?
Yeah, to build on that, I think, and Sanjay, you mentioned it in your earlier comments. I think the discussion is resonating from the perspective of it's requiring a value judgment that in the Canadian context doesn't really get to food. We make value judgments for the most part. The Americans tend to look at us from our healthcare system, our welfare system, our unemployment system, which is considered strong and tries to prop people up when they have a challenge. We do the same thing with farmers at a level. But the reality is we don't tend to make value judgments about food per se. And when you deal with the primary sector, Deb will probably remember having been at meetings. I used to do meetings all the time on farm programs. Well, it's our cheap food policy that's causing this issue. We don't have a cheap food policy. It doesn't exist. However, we do have a free trade system and a system that puts us in an integrated market with a country that's considerably larger than us and is the world leader, which creates both benefits and challenges. And in that same context, it means that we don't have the same structure necessarily at times with food. The US, there's days where, 30 to 35, maybe 40 million US children receive at least 2/3 of their calories at school, completely paid for by the US government. It's part of the Farm Bill, right? So I'm not suggesting that's a route for us. It's just that you're taking a further step in that value judgment, and that's part of this issue of supply chain resilience, right? At what point can we as a society think that the retailer needs to have a different level of policy intervention than the economic system we've empowered them with?
Yeah, no, and again, that widening of aperture that I hope we're all bringing I really want it to get right to the ground where people live. If we're not touching people where they live and seeing this as fundamental to Canada's health and its nationhood, I think we're not seeing that we're in the converging crises already. It's not something that's coming, we're there, and these things are circulating around us. And unless we help people where they are now, they're not going to be able to think long-term with us. We're not going to be able to meet them where they are and bring them, and let some people who can lead also lead. But there's an element that if we leave people hungry, we leave them desperate. I was working with a company called Harris, the Harris poll. They invited me to have some conversations with them. But they do these global polls on the state of citizens around the world, state of consumers around the world. And one of the things they said was what they're picking up around the world is a signal of desperation across all geographies that they haven't picked up on before, that's coming in as a strong signal. So we're having this conversation about understanding vulnerabilities at a time when Canadians are feeling more desperate. And that desperation is not just pocketbook, it's about how their tummies are feeling. Not just whether they're full, but whether they feel they can think straight. Long COVID has had a big impact on that. Brain fog is early, brain damage caused by this virus. So we really have to think about that. We also have to think about the farmers in their mid-50s who are going to be affected by longer-term issues around cardiovascular health, again, because of COVID. We don't want to lose that know-how. What's the signals that we need in terms of a metric of understanding what know-how we could possibly lose on the farm, in the supply chain, the kinds of expertise that different people in this room bring. I'm sure all of you could be on this panel having a conversation, and you just happen to be out the audience right now. So I think again, to all of you, just how we get right down to the human level so that the advanced work bringing together these systems and approaches can happen without leaving people behind, or more behind than they already are.
Very, very, very good. Just to check for questions in the room. Yeah, over here. I think we want.
As long as you project from where you are.
Okay, you're good. You're good.
Thank you to the panel. Really great conversation. I guess thinking about the scales and some of these issues from global to local, and maybe I think one optic could be global commodity trade. So like key big global factors like corn or canola or pork or like coffee. And then you've got local, like more, there's like that whole time we've had the last couple of decades, like farmers markets and that diversity. But we live in a global world and local at the same time. And, one of the first things I heard after the Russian-Ukraine battle started is like sunflower. I think sunflower oil like really had a big. So is there any tools or methodologies that could have a little bit more of an adaptive way that governments at different scales think about, like, we're at once in a global commodity trade and there's elements of value to that, providing food to those that need some of that security and places that maybe are in drought that need that food trade. And at the same time, those local resilient that is, aware of biodiversity and local ecosystems. I guess my question is, like, do we have like an adaptive, like science tool that could be more responsive or agile to the changes that what places need? And
Steve, you want to start us on that one?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it also at a level sums up how a lot of people view this idea of agri-food resiliency as well, right? Which is, we live in a global market. There's certain things that comparative and competitive advantage are important for us to, take advantage of, and let's then use those resources to focus on other things, which is a basic economic concept, but it's a complex one when you're dealing with basically the variety of issues we have. I think, again, in the Ontario context specifically, I think that there is a lot of tools and policies, etc., sort of already there in that context, right? The farmers markets, you said, the local, we have a local food act here in Ontario. There is a lot of resources, push, focus on direct marketing, those types of things. I think the challenge becomes is that when you're dealing with sort of a world where, you know, we want metrics, we want to be able to see things, we want to be able to measure things. Those types of transactions, business systems are, again, one of the more difficult things to measure, right? You know, and again, I think that the local food systems have a significant place, but they also tend to have a place with respect to people of means, right? It tends to be that local food specifically is something that, you know, you're selling direct to a consumer, a farmer's market. Those tend to be the people that are not of want, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that can't be an option, but it tends to be that the more higher income people have the luxury of making those choices, right? So I think that the systems are kind of there already. I think the challenge and maybe the fallacy is that the view that we can take them to a level that gets closer to the commodity side of things. And that's likely very unlikely. So how you balance those two pragmatically is difficult when the commodity side is easily measurable for the most part, right? Like I can tell you what the price of corn is in 2 seconds, we all can, right? But I can't tell you what the local price of fruits and vegetables are, you know, so.
So it's Mark, right?
Yes.
Mark, when I was leaving government service at the end of 2014, all quiet on the Western Front, we had put together for President Obama 2 action plans. One was, and both, by the way, were meant to try to serve as a active lever for providing resources to different scales of opportunity, but also to different sovereignties as well. And that was one of the biggest problems we face, is like, it be it geoengineering or be it the food distribution strategy, that you always ended up getting caught in a higher up political agenda or sovereignty issue. In order to get around that, USAID was working with us in developing a global climate service that could actually serve in providing scale right adaptation actions and services to communities, local communities, all the way up and all the way down. And the way it works is, to be quite frank, is it works at a local level with the blessing of the national government or provincial government, which gets one heavy subsidy from the United States government in order to let us go in and work at the more local level. So there have been attempts at doing this. USAID keeps going on and fighting their battles from the bottom up, and they have some great success stories, but a lot of failures. There's a need to develop that. I wouldn't call it a science tool, I'd call it a social tool. Something that really can help facilitate the shifting of the resources to the right places in the right scales. It's a great question.
Your question also plays up, so just briefly, it also brings up the whole issue of concentration in commodity markets and what we heard in the consultations about rising input costs, limited ability of consumers to deal with those costs, but also the arbitrage between those input costs, the production, and then what's happening at retail, which has become a big sort of national issue. So you really hit a whole bunch of good points with your comment. Thank you.
And where my head goes on this is, I think it's great that we have those systems. And I view them as adaptive, complex, and interrelated systems. But it brings the level of diversity that means that we can provide things to people who want, maybe you want that experience going to a farmer's market, maybe you want that experience going on to a farm and meeting the producer, or maybe you want to go to a grocery store and you want to put food in your grocery cart and go home. I mean, that's a fundamental consumer issue, the sovereignty of consumer choice. You know, that's foundational to me. And so I view this as a feature, not a bug. Where I think we need to be mindful and very cautious of is, as those things evolve, and they do evolve, where are the weaknesses that start to pop up around affordability of what I would sometimes call niche foods, high-end niche foods. I once was interviewed about a butcher shop in Toronto, I won't say which one, and my comment was, well, this is the meat for the elite when you've got to pay $25 for 4 hamburger patties. but there's a market for it. People are willing to pay for it. Okay, knock your socks off. But also be mindful that that's not for everyone, both in terms of preference and in terms of affordability. And then you have to layer on top of that the policy environment that we're working within. I can't imagine what it's like designing agricultural policies in that complex milieu where you've got those large scale commodity markets all the way down to people selling everything they grow on their farm right off their farm. And how do you have that adaptability, that flexibility to meet those things?
Very good, thanks. I want to go back to the chat here again. So a question. There's a general consensus that the global dietary transition towards westernized diets with high intakes of meat, refined fats, sugars, and salt has unhealthy outcomes for people and the planet. Healthy, more sustainable diets are widely recognized as necessary to mitigate climate change, reduce pressure on natural resources, including aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, as well as lower the global burden of disease. What needs bear with me. Somehow I lost it.
Houston, we have a problem.
Yeah, well, the problem might be me, but
We won't say that.
well, you know, I maybe I got enough of the question before it seriously disappeared on me. What, you know, when you think about some of these resilience problems and the potential for changing dietary patterns and dietary habits, what do you think we're looking at here? Is this sort of a marginal kind of a thing, or are we going to make a big contribution in that way?
I'll jump in just very briefly. I think part of this will be a pocketbook issue around which proteins will start to be affordable. And, you know, we for many years in Canada, rite of passage, if you're going to college or technical institute or university, was to eat a whole bunch of Kraft dinner and pizza slices. But now it's getting even more challenging for folks to figure out how they're going to get enough protein and how they're going to manage their diets in those situations. And so some people are going to a more plant-based diet because they feel forced into it. That's what they can afford. Cheaper for them to have some legumes and rice and some other options in that mix. So much will depend on food affordability and what happens to the classes as these stressors mount. If they shrink, even in the export markets where there's pork and things like that, meaning the middle classes shrink in China and India, places like that, that will have implications for our exports, but also for national food security, the kinds of consumer choices people make. And I think, you know, there are folks who are there to support a real shift towards plant-based.
Anybody else want to tackle that?
Yeah. So again, I think that Sanjay said pocketbooks will likely drive this to a large degree. The very base of that question is a function of growing incomes and people wanting something different than they currently have. And so again, I think that in that context, the degree to which people have become more educated over time about what is healthy, we've seen that already, right? The move on fruits and vegetables, it's been significant in that same context. So, you know, with income, with education, with accessibility comes options. With options comes changes in production patterns and changes in, you know, lifestyle, etc. So, I think it has the potential to change significantly. It's just a question of, you know, the level of what countries really drive it and where that fits into our broader production scheme. Do I foresee us growing lentils in southern Ontario that you know, less acres of corn? No. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a growth in it in some respects. And from a Western Canadian point of view, it's always been a sector that has a different type of rotation process that we do in Ontario. That's take off now.
So this, I actually wrote a dissertation that looked at food demand as incomes grow across the world. So I kind of know a bit about this. And one of the things that we know from decades of looking at this is as individuals become wealthier, as countries become wealthier on a per capita basis, at least on per capita expenditure, we see a substitution away from grain-based diets to animal protein-based diets. This is not rocket science. there's all sorts of measures about this, and there's a lot of evidence to support it. What's different now is that we've got alternative technologies that need the thing that we think of as protein looks different. And some of those might be acceptable and not strange to people in some cultures, but others might be like, well, what the heck is this? So we know that there's that gradient that as incomes grow, as expenditure grows, there's that substitution. But within countries that are lower income countries on average, what we also see is a great deal of inequality, both income inequality and health-based inequality and inequality with respect to education. So what I worry about is that we're going to continue to see that inequality, but for some pockets of some societies, we're going to see rising rates of really bad health outcomes because of the dietary change taken to an extreme. And I never like saying the adoption of a Western-based diet. To me, it's not east, west, north, south. It's about what's on your plate and how is it prepared. And we know that in the global south and in lower income countries, we're seeing rising rates of obesity. So, I'm expecting to start seeing diseases of affluence in those countries, like we see in Canada, in the United States, in parts of Europe. The Economist a couple weeks ago had a great article on the 700,000 excess deaths that they experienced in Great Britain over a period of about 5 years. And they documented where this is coming from. And it's not all COVID. A lot of it is based around people living in poor incomes, having lack of access to healthcare, having lack of access to adequate nutrition, sometimes being overnourished, sometimes being undernourished on key nutrients, and that has long-term consequences for human health and well-being and human development. So this is really complicated. There's no easy solution here, and we want to see countries become more prosperous. You want individuals to become more prosperous. This is, I think, a thread that we can all agree on. But we also need to be careful of how we get there and what we think of as what's on the plate is socially acceptable and culturally acceptable and also nutritionally acceptable for people in different parts of the world.
So can I just supplement the question for a moment? So let's go back to India, for example. So, I think there's some acceptance that probably broader global inflation, but inflation in food and energy in particular, we can attribute to some degree, maybe a large degree, to economic growth in China. Well, we know what's next. It's India, and it's a world society that's urbanizing and flourishing very quickly, and inclined to go from what has been a food net exporter to a food net importer, and also making use of public stockholding, which is periodically for us in Canada giving us problems as an export market. John, do you worry that as that urbanization and wealth trend increases, just having the capacity? Before we get into and grant more than nuance in terms of nutrition, but one of the vulnerabilities in supply chains is just the capacity to handle, and it's one thing when it's a surge is but just a level of it.
The four countries I worry about in that regard are China, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Vietnam has 100 million people. Indonesia has about 250 million people. You add them with China and India, if they start changing their consumption patterns and become net importers, that will fundamentally disrupt a lot of these large-scale global commodity markets, and that will have knock-on effect on supply chains. It's going to require a different level of shipping. It's going to require a different level of logistics. It's going to require different levels of information acquisition. It will fundamentally change agricultural and food markets.
It's a big lift.
Yeah. And that's also why the climate piece is so important to understand. With what you saw on one of the slides that Tom showed, where the temperatures start just getting redder and redder moving forward, even at the very low emission for that grandchild who's born in 2020, it's going to be a rough road at the very low emissions. It gets harder and harder. This is not a prosperous world. This is a world that's going from prosperous to maybe in certain cases survivable in an agricultural context. India and China's middle classes are very, very fragile. They're very fragile because the land and agricultural base are now prone to drought. The dust storms, aquifer depletion, all those sorts of issues are going to impact that. We're starting to see some disturbing reversals in India. Now, there might be ways to pump money into the economy. There might be central bank actions. There might be things that sort of prolong the lifespan of the middle class, but it won't be as long as you think. This could be very, very much impacted and radically changed in the next decade. So we're looking at very short lifespans, and the oceans, in terms of shipping, once you start looking at those sorts of issues, the oceans themselves are becoming rougher. They're harder to sail. The ports are going to be impacted in those locations because of port infrastructure. So if we want to ship things to places and their ports aren't being adapted to climate impacts and heavier seas and shoreline issues, we're going to see that too. So we have to map the global context and understand what's happening to those conditions within which supply chains are operating.
We're getting to the end of the session. I want to squeeze in one last question that comes from the chat here. Could any of the panelists elaborate on the role of public extension services or lack thereof in building resilience in Canadian agri-food systems and producers to compounding crises? What role can or should the Canadian government play in this? Maybe I'll just go over. Tom, do you want to start?
Well, it goes back to the issue we raised before about extension services. In the U.S., the U.S. Agricultural Extension Service, at least from what I've learned and working with them and at a state-by-state level, they serve as sort of the trusted and reliable resource in communities. And the most powerful communities, the ones that seem to have the biggest foresight capability, are the ones that have embedded in their cities or their towns the actual extension service agent himself or herself. But they're trusted because they're a member of the community. People came up to me when I first said, "Why do you trust them more than me?" I said, "When was the last time you were in our town hauling groceries around?" It's a good point. And I think that what can they serve? Well, I think they can serve as that communicator, that bridge between science and policy at any level and the actions that need to be taken at the more local level and up. I think they are one of what needs to be multiple set of bridges that span the scientists, the politicians, and the people that actually have to take action and live through this.
Others want to comment?
I just think there's a critical role, but because of the nature of federal-provincial relations, there still needs to be an element of collaboration to bring things down to the right local level. So, for example, the federal government set up something called the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. The province of Ontario decided not to go forward with a sort of a multi-stakeholder climate adaptation hub to bring together private sector, public sector experts in government to translate knowledge. But I think that kind of thing needs to be resurrected. And the Institute for Climate Choices is struggling getting down to the ground to meet actors and industries where they actually are. And so that extension piece really needs to be there, and that local trust, because there are hungry young experts and students who are going into ag and ag science, who want to be bridges to their communities or want to work in communities and want to have a life in those communities and want to be trusted members of a community. We have to figure out how to mobilize that in a big way.
Can I add to that? Because that's, I think about big E extension and little E extension. And I think the question is about big E extension, formal extension program. I think there's also the unwritten part of extension, which comes through the couple of undergraduates that we graduate every year from our college that go out into industry. It comes from our graduate students who are working with industrial partners on taking what they've learned and then putting it back into a translated way that is usable by a producer. And about groups like our Souls at Wealth group in our college, where we have an outreach and communication coordinator who marshals the 13 different soils researchers and brings that research to life in the eyes of producers by translating it, by turning that knowledge into action, but it's involving the producers. It's integrating yourself within their networks, both formal networks like the Ontario Soil Networks, but then also at a producer level, so that they're partners alongside trying to translate that information and push it out into the world. So, it's not I don't think there's a big E formal piece and a small E formal. I don't think there's tension there. We need to have both of those. But our students are our greatest asset.
Steve, 30 seconds?
Yeah, again, I completely agree. I think from my perspective, government's role in terms of research is the most important, making sure that universities, et cetera, have the resources to do the research to deal with the technical issues we talked about, and educating students is important. We don't have the offices that we once did, as an example, but the reality is that producers are far different now. Their resource requirements are completely different, and educating the sector, excuse me, the students that provide the services that deal with the large producers in particular is really key. And I think that's evolved appropriately.
Well, thanks, Steve. And Tom, thanks for your presentation. And to the panel, thanks very much for bringing your insight and expertise to this. And thank you again to our partner in this event, the Ontario Agricultural College University of Guelph. As always, all attendees will receive a link to the recording of today's webinar. We also ask that you fill out the post-event survey following the webinar. So to all in attendance and online, thanks very much for attending the session, and